Welcome to Demography Today lecture series, sponsored by the BBVA Foundation in coordination with the Lompop ITN Horizon 2020 project. And we have the pleasure today to have here Francesco Billari, who is the Dean of the Faculty and Professor of Demography at Bocconi University in Italy. At Bocconi, his activities are within the Department of Policy, Analysis and Public Management. He has served as president of the Dondena Center for Research on Social Dynamics and Public Policy, and as fellow of the Bocconi Initiative on Data Science and Analytics. He is a professorial fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford, and fellow of the British Academy. He has been president of the European Association for Population Studies and one of the founders of Population Europe, from which our department is as well part of the network of leading demography centers in Europe. He has worked for the University of Oxford, for the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, and his PhD in demography is from the University of Padua. He is currently editor of Population Studies and deputy editor of Demography, and he has one of the most prestigious grants in Europe, that is the European Research Council Advanced Grant. For us, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Francesco, we wanted to have you here in many occasions, and we managed in the end to bring you here. I hope that you're enjoying the time. And as usual, we allow the speakers to be presenting their talk for 1 hour or something around that, and then we will open the floor for questions. So welcome to Madrid, and I hope that you enjoy your stay here.
Oh, thank you very much, Diego. Thanks for being here. And this is also connected with the ERC project that has been mentioned by Diego, because it's basically more of a start than the end of a journey. And it's basically a tale of a demographer meeting the digital revolution. Not only in person, because I don't have my mobile phone here, giving the talk, but we know the digital revolution is there for all of us. So basically I will structure this talk in one introductory sections, two main parts, and the usual, let's say, way ahead and discussion. In the introduction, I will talk a little bit about why demography should care about the digital revolution. Then I will move towards looking at what is now big fashion, big data and demography, to move to the third part, which is about how the digital revolution is potentially shaping demographic behavior. And then I'll conclude. So why demography should care about the digital revolution? First of all, the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population cared about this. They accepted a proposal by Emilio Zagani, who's the guru of digital demography, and myself, to have a new panel on big data and population processes. So even if demographers sometimes are seen as decently conservative in the type of data sources they want to use, this is something that we are exploring, and we are not the only ones. So to say why demographers are justified to look at this issue of the digital revolution in a specific way, I'll talk a little bit about how demographers have used data in different periods. And this is really for demography, although it has implication for the social sciences as a whole. To do this, basically with Emilio Zagani, we look at 4 potential paradigms in the use of demographic data. This is a bit different than other periodizations that are being proposed, for instance, by Courgeot and colleagues. But as we will see, the use of digital data comes particularly natural. So demographers started from, in various definitions, you could think that demography started with Malthus, maybe the German school, but in terms of data, certainly the starting point is Gront in 1662 and the analysis of the bills of mortality. This was big data. I mean, for that time, they didn't have, of course, computers. It's unclear who actually did the legwork. It's possibly not a good computation of a life table, but it was the analysis of repurposed data. So this was data that were not collected for scientific research, but they were generated for other purposes. And the magic of scientists was in that period to repurpose data. And of course, then the mainstream of demographic research was about macro-level outcomes, population processes, and usually looking at censuses, administrative records, and even when micro-level data were used, it was mostly the use of such data to build tracks of population processes. Here we have a simple use of Google Ngrams, which is a source to track the use of some keywords in the English language books, but you can do it also for other sources, and these are books indexed in Google Books, and it's a neat way to depict the rise of the census in books over time. This is a percentage, so it's a relative measure until let's say the 70s, where the census reaches its peak and becomes to decrease. So first paradigm, census and administrative record in order to generate macro-level outcomes. Second paradigm, demography moves micro and becomes life course research. In a sense, it's always been potentially that because micro-founded demography, life course research is usually looking at time to events, which is the life table, basically Gront, repurposed methods. Gront moving micro. The paper of David Cox on regression models and life tables is in 1972, and basically micro analysis of life tables, if you look at Google Ngram up there, are reaching the traditional mention of life table. Here, for instance, we look at proportional hazards, which is a specific term linked to Cox. And proportional hazard after the year 2000 is basically reaching the life table. Here we can also see the rise and fall, in this case in particular, mostly the rise, but in one case we see clearly the fall, of micro-based demographic surveys. This is the World Fertility Survey, the blue one. And then demographic and health surveys that are still at their peak. The idea of this period is that micro-level outcomes are fine. If we look at determinants of demographic behavior, we may be happy to stop at the micro level. In a sense, most demographic journals are still based on that assumption. The third potential paradigm is a paradigm that is clearly not yet there. So I'm talking of 4 periods, but not even the third is there. And this is a response to the idea that macro-level outcomes were important for demographers. You want to understand population processes. You want to understand why mortality is high or low, why fertility is decreasing, and not necessarily only about micro-level analysis of a specific behavior. Moreover, we want to understand how the interaction between individuals is shaping macro outcomes. And so the idea here is that data has to meet theory, micro has to meet the micro, and the way I propose to do that, borrowing from other frameworks, is to separate two stages in demographic research: discovery and explanation. Discovery has to do with macro level outcomes and macro level associations, which is luckily still there in demography, but has been banned from most of social scientists, for most of social scientists. So one way to call discovery would be to say description, but if you say descriptive for a piece of research, this is basically destroying it. And this is a mistake, because some descriptions are really discovering something new, and they are worth. And that's one of the beauty of demography within the realm of social sciences that tend to produce research that is only coming after a long period after what we want to discover has happened. And we should keep it. But it's mostly about macro level associations. A second stage will have to understand how this macro level changes. And let's say stage one is legitimate. The second level of explanation is based on what is known mostly in sociology as the Coleman framework, basically explaining macro level changes through the micro level. And the most difficult part here is understanding how micro level outcomes aggregate in order to generate macro level outcomes. So some folks are using here simulation models to cover this periods, let's say to cover this gap between the micro and macro level. This is not really a successful paradigm, but it's potentially there. Assuming this paradigm will get there, we may even have a fourth paradigm, and the word is not ours, but it's basically well around in data intensive research. So the fourth paradigm is about data intensive scientific discovery. It has several features where we want to understand something that is more democratic, more decentralized, more open science, which is not something folks were used to have before. None of these three previous periods had easy access to data, replicability, and this kind of distributed features that will have a fourth paradigm, data intensive. A second feature is that in most of the previous period, non-probabilistic data were banned from science, especially from social science. In the fourth paradigm, maybe non-probabilistic data may gain a life, not only for experiments, this is where they're already recognized, but also for other purposes. And I will try to show you some example. And the key there is how to handle bias. In the meanwhile, what helps the emergence of this paradigm is that there is an increasing difficulty in collecting survey data, for instance, because of difficulty to reach respondents. And so connecting survey data with new data may become something crucial for the fourth paradigm. And so if this fourth paradigm is there to come, the key will be repurposing data, going back to Gront, data collected for another purpose, Twitter data, but used suddenly for research on demographic behavior, and repurposing methods, using methods that were developed for survey data, for census, on new data. But this is something not yet there. So if anywhere, we are around the third paradigm. So if we want to understand a potential issue, which is the emergence of the fourth paradigm, we ought to look at big data and demography. And that's the next step of the talk. And how do we deal with that? We usually think about the breadcrumbs that people leave when going around the world, either virtually or physically. And these are digital breadcrumbs. So when we move, our phones leave track of where we are. When we do something online, this is leaving some tracks. Can we use this? The simple answer is, of course, we can. And there are areas of research that are only devoted to this. And here I'm touching upon three examples, three types of research that look at demographic behaviors in different ways. And this is all done with collaborators. So one of the key issues with the emergence of the fourth paradigm is that it requires collaboration in larger teams compared to the previous era of lone researchers or small teams and potentially interdisciplinary teams. So the first bit I want to deal is the missing girls bit. Maybe most of the audience is familiar with the issue. We have, in particular, parts of the world where there are not enough women. Why? Because we have differential mortality that is penalizing young girls, but above all, we have sex-ratio birth that is distorted through sex-selective abortion. And here, the issue is, can we do something that is seen as very traditional in demography, indirect estimation, using techniques that are developed to have an analysis of incomplete data or data that are not directly collected for one purpose to measure sex-ratio birth. This is what we explored in what is called in this field nowcasting exercise. So it will be indirect estimation if you use the demography journal. It is nowcasting in the big data jargon to look at sex-ratio birth. And this is done using the theory and the knowledge of how this is carried. This is India and the states of India. In some states, the sex-ratio of birth is not distorted. Let's say the blue and green states have sex-ratio of birth that are very close to what is the biological standard. The red and orange, yellow states are states in which the sex-ratio of birth is fairly above the natural ratio, meaning that there are too many boys born than girls to believe that there has been no sex-selective abortion, okay? So how does sex-selective abortion work? There's various ways, but let's say the technological way is that you need ultrasound to discover the sex of the child, which is forbidden in India. So it's hard to ask this in survey. So how did we come about with this? Very simple, Google search. If people suddenly search for ultrasound, compare in this case for methodological, the methodological trick is that we compare ultrasound searches to X-ray searches, which has nothing to do with the behavior. We try to reconstruct whether there is a particular demand for sex-selective abortion. And this is then used to derive nowcasts by using a statistical model of sex-ratio of birth. And potentially we could derive a trend for the sex-ratio of birth for the states that are particularly biased, where, by the way, sex-ratio of birth is more biased for the highly educated. We also don't know whether what is known as the ground truth data, the estimates that are provided by statistical officers at the state level, whether they are good. So, for instance, our nowcast derived from Google search may potentially be even better than the ground truth data. But the bottom line is that we can have estimates for 2016. we can anticipate trends. Example number 1, indirect estimation, now known as nowcasting. Okay, example number 2 is certainly related, but somehow completely different. And then we'll go back to Google search for number 3. Example number 2 is about something that is one of the very few mainstream theories or ideas in demography, the idea of a second demographic transition. The idea of the second demographic transition is interpreted in many ways by different scholars, but I could say that the main argument is the disconnection between marriage and fertility, and the fact that this disconnection is spreading all over big parts of the world. There is a discussion whether it's all over the world, but so can we look at what Lestag and others have defined as the footprints, which is more or less the same as the breadcrumbs, of ideational change by looking at what happens on the web. And this is one example, again, looking at long-term development, Google Ngrams, the disconnection between motherhood and marriage. This is the US literature in the long term. Small sign that starting from the 60s, there is a disconnection in books between the terms mother and the term wife. They used to be pretty parallel. And there is an emergence of partner, although partner here can also have a business meaning. But we're not using this data, but we're using the same concept. If motherhood becomes more prevalent with respect to the position in a marriage, this is a sign of ideational change or the second demographic transition. How do we do this? Twitter and Goffman. How Goffman was about the presentation of self in everyday life. How do folks present themselves in the digital everyday? Oh, by looking at profiles. So here you see 2 Twitter profiles. We are using US data. So one is a Christ follower, husband, worship leader, and a musician. It's probably also a father, but you see husband is what is really displayed here. The second there is a mommy, blogger, creator of Mocha Parents Ozone Kids, racial equity consultant, educator, researcher, believer in the brilliance of black children. So this is tradition, and that's the second demographic transition. So what we do is basically look at things like the ratio of mentioning parenthood to mentioning marriage in the presentation of self on Twitter. Oh, there are some challenges here. This is another example. The data are a bit dirty. This has been the case forever in demography. It's also the case for digital data. So this guy is not about demographic behavior. He's a sugar daddy and 6 sugar baby, business interest in Russia, Ukraine, New York City. So clearly not relevant for the kind of fatherhood, husband relationship that we want to study. And this is the kind of data one has to face. So what we did was just to count by state. This is exploratory research. And so that's the way one does it in the 4th paradigm. The ratio between referring to parenthood and referring to marriage. And this is the map by state. We did it for men and for women, so father or daddy, variations around fatherhood and husband. So there is more mentioning usually than of parenthood than of being a spouse. And that's true in particular if you look at US data, for instance, there is a slight eastward gradient. Of course, there is a challenge in the US because there's lots of lone parenthood, especially for women. What we did was to ask Lisa Niedert at the University of Michigan, who developed with Ron Lestage an index of the second demographic transition in the US, and just to show very simply that our strategy looking at the presentation of self on Twitter was correlated with an index of the second demographic transition, which is having kind of modern family behavior. Example number 2, looking at theory by repurposing data. There is much more to do in this framework. Let me go to example number 3. And it's, let's go back to Google. So there's a book on the Googleization of everything. What's the idea? Basically, sorry, I'll go back. If we take any decision now, we first ask something to Google. Think about yourself. Do you take serious decisions by not having looked at something using Google? Maybe, of course, there are exceptions, but what we need is approximation. So what's the most serious decision we can take in life? Possibly having a child, okay? Because it's irreversible, or let's say hardly reversible. You can reverse marriage, you can reverse home living, you can even reverse a divorce and remarry. You can reverse migration in most cases if there are no wolves. But yeah, once you become a parent forever. So Google and fertility. Can we exploit the same idea first? Do people search for fertility-related terms, and then does this track fertility? But also linked to the second point, can we track the different meanings of fertility by looking at what happens in terms of Google search? First here, I'm just showing you and chatting about that. I don't want to go into detail. There's a paper by Kearney and Levine on the American Economic Review looking at the MTV series 16 and Pregnant. And when this series is shown, suddenly there's a spike in Google search for terms related to contraception and abortion. This is about teenage pregnancy in the US. And this paper is claiming that the TV series is influencing teenage pregnancy rates, and there is a boost in internet search activities. In that other unpublished paper, which with Francesco D'Amore and Yuri Marcucci, we presented at the Population Association of America in 2013, we could show that one could do short-term forecasts up to 12 or 24 months of fertility by looking at Google search terms. So think about that. Before having a child, you will do some search on Google. We are capturing that. Actually, Google is capturing that even better. They have better data than researchers have at the moment. A second bit of research is a short paper with Yussi Oyala, Emilio Zagani, and Ingmar Weber about the different kinds of searches that people do around fertility. How did we do it? We used a platform provided by Google, which is called Google Correlate, where you can have any data, any time series data by regions. And this can be potentially correlated with search behavior. Of course, it may be data crunching. But again, big data should be handled with care, and in principle, one could gain something interesting. For instance, what we did is using US data at the state level, but you can also go at lower level, potentially. we look at different types of fertility information, which is to the right there. For instance, unmarried, married fertility, fertility for higher educated, fertility at younger and older ages. I'm not implying that old means 35, not at all. It's just because we needed a short term. Okay, in principle, we could learn nothing, but I think we learned something. By Google Correlate, we learned that these were the terms, the search terms, that were mostly correlated with different types of rates. And this was telling us really about the circumstances that are surrounding births for different groups in the US. So if you take general fertility, the most correlated term is pregnancy workout, baby tummy, and so on. If you take unmarried fertility in the US, I'm afraid this term is very much correlated with chlamydia and gonorrhea, biblical names, and we know that sexual searches for sexual behavior and religion are correlated online in the US from other research, not our research. Treatment for chlamydia, paternity tests, transmitted disease. This is very different from the marital fertility rates, which are correlated with nursing cover, jogging stroller review. So this running jogging stroller, I will probably need it. Double jogging stroller, nursing pads, jogging stroller, and so on. For instance, if you look at the rich correlation, post-pregnancy, Kiko Key, I'm very proud because Kiko is a company from nearby Milan, but Kiko Key seems to be a high-end stroller. And flying while pregnant, I mean, this is really a kind of a first word upper-class problem, flying while pregnant. For low-educated, for instance, how to potty train is something that we see as correlated. So potentially, by looking at what is correlating with different types of demographic rates, we can gain insights into what is the behavior around birth of different folks. And this is something we didn't know before. Okay, so big data. But if we really do this, if we search for information on the web, if the web can tell us about demographic behavior, can we assume that the web and, let's say, the digital revolution at large is potentially changing demographic behavior? This is the next part of my talk. And I will touch upon two issues. Is the internet changing fertility? And this is, again, even more work in progress. And the second, is the internet changing social contacts? A very relevant question. But is it a demography question? Yes, because it's possibly a big social science question, but in aging, we know that social contacts are crucial for health, so we want to understand what's going on there. First, internet and fertility, and say, oh, why will internet influence fertility at all? I mean, first of all, after you've seen what we had before, you're probably not surprised. I mean, of course, if people look at information on the internet, that must have an effect. But here we have a broader set of effects. I mean, first of all, just remind that internet has been a fast technology to diffuse. This is from Pippa Norris' book, The Digital Divide, showing the spread of different type of medias, and the net, which is down there at the end of the 90s, is at least as fast as the TV in American history, as a sudden technology that is appearing in folks' life, getting to 100% of households. These are Italian data, sorry, not Italian, Actually, Italy is not even there. This is European Social Survey data, some estimates of European data access showing that, of course, there is an explosion of the internet. This is data between 2002 and 2010. Then the European Social Survey stopped collecting this data and showing that daily use of the internet is getting close to 100%, and I could say, of course, for people of reproductive ages. So why would the internet affect fertility? I mean, a first issue is all big technological changes have affected fertility. And I'm not going back to the first demographic transition. I'm jumping to recent changes. For instance, the second demographic transition we discussed before, the disconnection between marriage and fertility, was possible once you had contraceptive technologies that allowed to disconnect sex and reproduction. The pill. And this was then linked, this is the second demographic transition idea, let's say contraceptives as a precondition, modern contraceptives, and Claudia Goldin at Harvard and her collaborators have elaborated on that, on the global changes introduced by the widespread use of the contraceptive pills. Other researchers, in particular in economics, have looked at the adoption of household technologies. So if you don't want to use a washing machine now, you're pretty in a low, in a small group. Household appliances and medical advances have been other technologies that have shaped our fertility behavior. And let's say, not only fertility, but in general, economic behavior, I would say, and social behavior. Let me go back to possible mechanisms. Why would the internet affect fertility? We have several potential channels, all of which can be studied. We don't do all this. This is, again, to start with. I mean, first of all, internet may have an effect on sex. And despite the second demographic transition, despite the disconnection between sex and reproduction, still, for the moment, sex is, in majority of births, a precondition to having a child. So anything that affects sexual behavior may also affect the internet, the fertility. It's probably ambiguous. We saw before maybe having information is leading to a later timing of birth, more perfect information on the use of contraceptive, better information on what is the potential life course that you are facing if you have a very early birth. So sex may change, and as a consequence, fertility will change. Second, again, the vast majority of children are born in partnerships, married or cohabiting partnership. Is the internet changing the partnership market? Of course, there's a paper by sociologists Rosenfeld and Thomas on the rise of the internet as the social intermediary in the marriage market. Basically, most people have online interactions before meeting nowadays, and this is shaping the partnership market in a specific way, and this in turn may have an effect on fertility. It's unclear what the effect is. There's some research arguing that marriage rates are increasing where the internet becomes more accessible. There are other research, and there may be theoretical reasons to think that preferences are becoming very tailored, so we become very picky, and this may postpone partnership formation that is leading to fertility. I'm talking about that. There is an effect on repartnering, and we know that in the era of low fertility, second and higher order unions are very important in terms of share of the total fertility rate. Third mechanism, we already discussed that, is information, and information is not only about sexual and reproductive health, but it may be information on potential life course outcomes, on what will my life be if I postpone having a child or if I have a child now. We discussed about search, but the internet is allowing to have more social interaction, including with other friends and relatives, which may shape, as we know, fertility choices. We take for granted that social interaction is shaping fertility. A fourth mechanism that I'm very interested in is a kind of a progressive one, I would say, is, let's say, work-family balance, and you could say, potentially as a negative bit, time allocation. So the internet may allow us to combine work and family in a better way. And this is in particular true at ages that have become the challenge for fertility. Let's say ages at which people are more engaged into the labor market, and I'm talking both of women and men. And so this will bring a recuperation of fertility at higher ages. You could also have the opposite view and say the internet is destroying our family life. Internet is eating on our family life. Of course, this will mean ignoring that family life is eating into working life through internet technologies. But there's a book by Dalton Colney called Elsewhere USA, and his idea is that even when we are in a family, we're always somewhere else, elsewhere. And this is clearly something that will help us predicting that when the internet is spread, we don't want to have a big family. We are always elsewhere, while we want to have more kids. Even if we take the positive view, there is something important, which is a digital divide. So not all occupations can be basically externalized from the main place of work. Not in all cases we can take advantage from the internet in terms of work-family balance, and we'll see that. And this is connected with the gender issues that I will discuss later. A fifth mechanism, which is sort of trivial, is we know that the internet is affecting the economy, and now we know that fertility is procyclical, so it's the economy is stupid. I mean, there is no direct effect on fertility, it only runs through the economy. I will argue that there is a mixture of the previous mechanism. So how do we do this? We look at different sources in the more traditional way of doing demography, so surveys and register or administrative data, mostly from the US, but also the European Social Survey. The first analysis is looking at the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. This is a cohort study from the US where young people are followed over time. And as I will show you, we have some information on their internet access. The data are between 2003 and 2011 because we need the presence of data on internet access. And of course, one of the challenges in understanding the effect of the digital revolution is that we need to get something about before the digital revolution and while the digital revolution is happening. And we will see that for the US, this is already potentially too late, but we try to do our best with this data. We can then do what we described before, let's say event history analysis, so in the spirit of the second paradigm. On NLSY, there are two types of individual level data on access to internet, access to internet in general, and access to internet from home, which is, however, stopping in 2008. This is already showing you some of the problems. Access to internet was already quite common. You currently have access to internet was in theory quite common already in 2003 in this sample. It basically went up if we look at from home, but we have no explicit measure on the frequency of data. So what is striking is here. We are looking at mostly young people in the US. This is having one birth in the first period, 2003, 2007, divided by having no access, which you remember is a minority group, and access to the internet. And we see here that no access to the internet is linked to significantly higher chances of having a child. This is consistent with what I told you before about younger folks potentially postponing having children when there is access to new technology. The difference is decreasing over time. And of course, is it because the better off have access to the internet and the worse off have no access to the internet? Of course, we can do a nice multivariate model for that, and the simple answer is, if you like multivariate models, is here. Internet access has a postponement effect on fertility, even when we can control for a bunch of social background factors, including income and education of the parents, and so on. What we can try to explicitly test, although this is not really a causal test, is whether all the difference goes through partnership, or let's say the postponement of partnership formation. That would be an interpretation in this case, which is not the case here. And I'm jumping to this graph. So these are predicted probabilities of having a child by a specific age, according to whether there is no internet access in blue, internet access in red. Although this is still not conclusive, because we have to stop at age 30, not only because the data are there, but we have the data until then, but because then the internet becomes more or less widespread to the whole sample. We can see the postponement idea. If anything, the internet has the effect of postponing births at early ages, and then there is a crossover. Maybe there will be something different at later ages. So potentially different mechanisms. A first mechanism when there is information, some interaction on the future trajectory, and a second mechanism that is taken off here, which maybe is giving us a sign that, for instance, work-family balance or different kinds of information search are reversing the effect of the internet. So what we did was to look at different data, which are less clean than NSY, but allow us to have a broader scope, including some instrumental variable ideas to try and get a more causal estimate of the effect of internet diffusion. And in particular, in these studies, except for the European data, we were looking at broadband diffusion. Broadband, as differentiated from other types of internet access, is particularly relevant if you want to study the work-life balance mechanism. The idea that you can work from home in a stable way is basically connected to broadband. And if you like causal identification, of course, this is something where we use variation over time. It's very hard to fully believe in the causal interpretation here, but this is the most one could do without explicit experiments. Again, starting from correlation, this is about US states and the presence of a child younger than 5 in the household. and high-speed internet access in different households. I'm not claiming this is big results. There is a positive correlation. If we believe that this has to do with work-life balance, we want to do something that is obvious. Where there is high-speed internet, there is also more telework. The outlier there is Washington, D.C., where there are several public servants in the US, and telework is part of the deal. Okay, we could do something more with the data. But this is the spirit, using variation in broadband diffusion and connecting that to variations in either fertility or in the presence of children, which is not ideal if you want to study fertility, but it's something that one can use from survey data that are cross-sectional. This is, for instance, using the current population, the CPS, current population survey, internet supplement. The problem here is the dependent variable is about the presence of a child in a household now, and we have the data on access to internet now. So it's not clear whether we are looking at deciding to have a child or making a decision to just after birth. But using the instrumental variable, we hope to inject a little bit of exogeneity here. And the bottom line is that the internet has an effect, and I'm happy to go back on how the instrumental variable approach is used here. The internet has an effect on later ages, and positive one, and on married fertility for ages 30 plus. So this is consistent with the work-family mechanism. There is also a digital divide. If you believe the work-family balance mechanism, this has to show up differently for different groups. And what we could do is to distinguish high and low educated in a very rough way. And this is showing up as we expected. The effect is bigger for women and men who are high educated, and it's significant and positive only for them. So the internet may indeed allow us to combine work and family in a better way, but only if your educational level is allowing you to get a job where the internet is relevant as a combination device. So that's the negative side of the story. New inequalities in family. These are different data. These are birth data from natality detailed vital statistics. And so this is not instrumental variable approach, but looking at the same broadband diffusion as it relates to different types of birth rates. So similar to the ones we were using for Google Correlate, it shows up again as broadband coverage being positively related to high-skilled fertility and with married fertility. If we want to believe this, we could also do what is known as a placebo test. So broadband diffusion should predict fertility after broadband is there, 99 to 2004, but not before. There was no internet, why would it affect? So we do the same test by looking as a dependent variable previous fertility rates, and we don't find any effect. Since we are in Europe, we try to do what can be done with the European Social Survey, which is not much. The European Social Survey can be used a little bit like the CPS by looking at the presence of children in the household, so not actual fertility behavior, and treating the differential deployment of the internet in European regions as something that will instrument individual internet access. We find, however, something strikingly similar. The effect is positive on ages 30 plus, and there is a digital divide also in Europe. So the internet is probably indeed shaping our fertility behavior. My second example on how the internet is shaping our life is perhaps the most obvious and direct, is the internet ruining our social life? Or is it improving our social life? This is a classic of any modernization theory in sociology. I mean, new technologies, the city, new lifestyles are destroying the social cohesion we used to have. So by definition, the internet is really destroying our life. Can we study that? Of course, we can, and there's various ways to do it. However, remember, it's not immediately easy to understand whether it's really the internet and what is the causal link that is going on. We try to replicate somehow the same design we did for fertility, so using the differential deployment of the internet in European states and regions over time, and using the European Social Survey, but looking not at fertility-related outcomes, but at social contacts. And in particular, the European Social Survey, although not in all waves, so this is a repeated cross-sectional survey, 2002, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2010, and then they stopped collecting fertility. For each of these years, there is a question to all respondents whether they use the internet and how frequently they do it, from no access to every day. It's unfortunate that we didn't have a big focus on that before, because maybe we would have had better data, but I'm sure now creatively demographers and other social scientists will retrospectively reconstruct what's going on. So loneliness is an outcome which is according to an ordinal variable. Meeting socially is again an outcome which is about an ordinal variable, whether the respondent meets socially in a high or low frequency. Having a discussion partner is just a binary variable, whether you have someone you can talk to about personal matters. And then there is a question on the frequency of social activities, which is basically allowing people to compare themselves with people of the same age, which is tricky, as we know, in surveys. But we basically use all them when they're available, which is not always. And so this is a big table. I hope, especially for those who are seeing that in the video, you'll have time to reconstruct this. And we are looking at the effect of having an additional bit of internet access on a scale. We use different types of definition for internet access on these 4 bits. And the OLS is a standard multivariate regression model with some other control variables, with some dummy variables for the round and the region. The IV is using the same strategy as we discussed for fertility. So basically instrumenting individual internet access with internet access at the regional level. Positive effect on meeting socially. So the internet is not destroying our social meetings. Maybe it's enabling more social meetings. Of course, there will have to be other data to discuss this. The presence of a discussion partner. Here we have an interesting difference between the OLS and IV, indicating that perhaps adoption of internet may be endogenous to the idea of having a discussion partner. If there is a difference between what we find with traditional multivariate methods and instrumental variable methods, it may also be that there is an endogeneity. So you want to have a discussion partner, you get the internet. But that is not showing up with meeting socially. In terms of social activities, which is a tricky question because it's comparative, we have the same result as the discussion partner, which is a bit weird because we probably would want to have results that are similar to meeting socially. The last bit is about loneliness, and we know that loneliness is usually measured with long scales because it's also potentially, it's something that is potentially leading to clinical conditions. Here it's a very simple one-item question. The negative effect indicates that the internet is decreasing the responses about feeling lonely. So basically, the internet is improving social contacts. Are there digital divides? Is this different for people of different gender? No. I don't have the time to stop here, but the bottom line is that there is no differential effect by gender. By different educational level, perhaps, but it's not obvious. If anything, it's a non-linear effect, but I don't want to go into this detail now. By the way, this is research with Patrick Bragg, who's at the University of Oxford, and Leah Elvart at Cologne. And maybe what is interesting for demographers and folks studying aging is there a age heterogeneity. Of course, here things become a bit more challenging. You will want to look at the elderly, but the elderly are those for which you have a little bit more randomness because of lower levels of internet access. So the bottom line is that we cannot conclude that there is a bigger or smaller effect for the elderly. But if we look at point estimates for loneliness and meeting socially, the effects seem to be more relevant for the elderly, which will be in line with maybe what we would want to have from a good technology. In the end, having access to this new technology may allow the elderly to feel less lonely. And that will be something particularly relevant for those of us who study aging. So let me wrap up and conclude. The digital revolution is here to stay. And it is here also for demography today, which is this series. It's consistent, if we take it seriously, with the evolution of demographic data paradigm. So it's nothing that is particularly surprising for folks who have been around demography. Because basically there are repurposed data on demographic behavior and the determinants of demographic behavior. And this may be on a broader population scale than before. In a sense, think about the fourth paradigm, it's more democratic. We don't just know about a handful of rich countries, but we can know about more people. We were happy to have probabilistic samples for small populations, and we can look at the behavior of large population. The digital revolution, however, is also changing demographic behavior, which is not surprising. All major technological changes have had an influence on demographic behavior. So there's a bunch of substantive issues. This is the start and not the end of a journey. Are there new inequalities? We already saw probably yes, but that's very interesting and important also for policymakers to understand. Work family spillovers may work both ways, so you can work from home, but you can do family-related business from work. And that's something that we may underestimate at the moment. The digital revolution may influence population aging, and we saw one example. In terms of demographic methods, can we use digital breadcrumbs for nowcasting and forecasting? And the simple answer is probably yes, and we should. Is there a different impact of the digital revolution in different parts of the world? For instance, in several countries, mobile phones are the main telecommunication technology before even having wired communication. And then we need to understand the difference between smartphone, broadband, and other digital technologies. There are challenges, of course. Training challenges, less traditional training, more open science, which is not something that is a specialty of demographers. In particular, we have a long tradition of statistical offices that have not been very keen on sharing data. That's the new paradigm, open science and replicability. There has to be more multidisciplinary collaboration. Computer scientists come back. And when will this become mainstream? For sure it will become mainstream. When will that happen? So to conclude, I'd like to acknowledge a long list of co-authors: Niccolò Cavalli, Ridi Kashap, and Patrick Preb, Francesco D'Amori, Yuri Marcucci, Lea Elvart, Osea Giuntella, Jussi Oyala, Eric Chian, Maria Sironi, Ingmar Weber, Emilio Zagani. So it takes multidisciplinary, multinational, and a fun group to work with on this data. I'd like to conclude acknowledging that 7 years ago, just down the road from here, Inter won the treble with the Champions League, so it's great to be in Madrid 7 years after. Thank you very much.